The global demographic collapse is the problem that has occurred over the past 60 to 100 years or so, where birth rates across the world have been declining in most countries. The worst declines can be seen in countries like Japan, South Korea, and other Oriental nations. But this problem has been occurring across the world, with maybe the exception of sub-Saharan Africa and India and Bangladesh. Even in those countries, there is a clear trend that is starting to show that birth rates are declining in those nations. I wanted to make this video because I've got some interesting thoughts on how this issue is discussed, because this issue has only started to be discussed in mainstream politics for about a year or two. What is quite interesting to me is lots of people, even people who have looked at the data and who are data experts, talk about this issue as if there is one constant issue or one main constant issue that has started this problem 60 or so years ago and is continuing this problem forward. I disagree with that reasoning because the world is a very different place to what it was 60 years ago, and the generations of people who made the decision to have less children or wait to have less children is different. The cultural factors are different and the economic factors are different. For example, 60 years ago in most Western countries, when this problem of lower birth rates started to rear its head, people could buy houses without getting mortgages or with at least getting very small mortgages. In the UK, that's now impossible or improbable for most people because the average house price is 9 times the average salary. So it's often said by a lot of people in the low birth rate sphere that finances are not the reason or are a very insignificant reason why people are having less children. But I would disagree with that in a UK context, certainly among Zoomers. So that is people between the ages of 18 to 25-ish. It's slightly wider than that, but you get the idea. Zoomers, for the most part, will not be able to afford a house. Certainly not buying it on their own, certainly not buying it without a mortgage. I mean, the estimates that I've seen say that the average Zoomer, when they buy their first house, will be 40. Though historically lots of people have started to have children without being financially secure, it's important to note and consider that certainly within the last 100 years or so, it was highly likely that those people who were starting to have children when they were perhaps less financially secure would have been financially secure. Because, okay, my grandparents bought their first house when my mum was 2, but they knew when my grandma got pregnant that they would be able to afford a house in 2 years because they'd done the budgeting and they were saving. Food was more expensive in those days. However, I would argue from my brief analysis of data, I'm no data scientist, but the way it seems to me is certainly through most of the 20th century, people were financially better off than they are now, especially young people. I mean, when I talk to my grandparents about this, especially my grandparents when they still worked, one of my grandparents is a coach builder, and he has said that his wages from about 1990, something happened then, everyone knows what, have been going down in real terms. And he retired in 2020. And then he said he was earning less than, adjusting for inflation, of course, than he was when he was an apprentice. So I think certainly in Anglosphere countries, the financial problem is certainly an issue among Zoomers, which is deterring Zoomers from having children. But it is an interesting point that the financial issue is not the main reason, certainly not in most places, for children being born less, or people wanting to have less children, or any children at all. I would also make the point that the reasons why people had less children or wanted to have less children in the 1960s are probably different from the main reasons that people don't want to have children now. There are factors that I would say are pretty universal, such as the education or over-education of not just women, but everybody. If you're a Zoomer, you're probably not going to start working full-time or earning any significant amount of money until you're in your mid-20s. Another factor, certainly in the West, is video games and pornography. You have a very significant number of men and a lower number of women checking out society and playing on video games and living on the dole, or whatever benefit or state security they can get. This is something that is quite a very significant problem in the United States because it's millions of men who are economically inactive who, from any research, can or are being allowed to sit on their backsides and play video games. That certainly is a significant factor. There's another factor that is argued that prosperity is the reason why people are having less children, and I'm not necessarily convinced of that, because if you put infant mortality rates and deaths in childbirth aside, people in the pre-industrial age and even the industrial age were in some ways financially better off, to the extent that finance existed for those people. I mean, a good example of this is the bone density of medieval peasants. Peasants, for the most part, in the medieval period were not malnourished. Even in the mini ice age, which preceded the medieval warm period, which ended in the 14th century, peasants were not commonly, from what we can tell by examining their bones, malnourished. They had very high levels of bone density. And there's an idea that people lived in hovels. So medieval people lived in mud brick huts. And I'm not sure to what extent that's true, because not far away from my grandma's village, there is a village where there are 3 houses that are pre-12th century. And those houses are farmhouses that belonged to rural people, peasants. And without doxing myself and explaining where my grandma lives, those houses are worth in excess of $500,000 now. So I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that in real terms, pre-industrialized people did have a standard of living that we in the modern age would recognize as normal and not being dire poverty. My main point here is that the way we think of the causes for the demographic collapse is there's one main factor that is universal across the world, or there are a couple of main factors that are universal across the world. Whereas what I would suggest is it's far more complicated than that, because different parts of the world are in different stages. So there will be factors in other parts of the world that are not factors in, say, the West, that are affecting and encouraging people not to have children. In some parts of the world, it might be incentivized for people not to have children, And in others, it might be a reason to do with economics, or children are more of a nuisance than they are a benefit. I mean, in a lot of really poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, children are actually a net positive to the family's income. So this problem, the problem of demographics, is not an easy problem to solve. And I'm not really sure what we can do about it, even if there is anything that can be done with it. In terms of solutions, or whether a solution would work or not, this is very difficult because there are countries that have tried economic incentives, such as Hungary, and the data on that shows that it works very marginally and then it stops working. I'm not sure whether this is proof that all solutions and even all economic incentives aren't going to work. But from my time that I've spent in Hungary, Hungary is in a very different place to the UK in terms of the standard of living of young people. So in the UK, most Zoomers either live with their parents or live in shared housing, student accommodation, that type of thing. Very few Zoomers can afford to rent a place on their own, let alone buy a place on their own. Whereas that isn't true in Hungary. Hungary, lots of young people rent their own places, or maybe will rent a place with one or two friends, but it's very common, certainly in Budapest and Szeged, at least from my observations, for young people in their early 20s or maybe even teens to go off and rent somewhere on their own. And my point here is, in Hungary, the reason or the main reason why Zoomers aren't having children isn't financial, because the way your average Hungarian 20-something lives is much better than the way your British 20-something lives in material terms. And I'd also argue spiritually as well. So in countries where the young people have a good standard of living, such as Hungary and lots of places in Eastern Europe as well, young people have quite a good standard of living, financial incentives to have children probably aren't going to be that effective, because if you're a Hungarian 20-something, even if you have a girlfriend or something like that, the incentives aren't going to change your lifestyle or standard of living that much, because you've got your bare necessities and you probably have a significant disposable income. In terms of social reasons and societal problems, it's unclear whether societal changes will encourage people to have children in large numbers, because as far as I'm aware, nothing has changed in any country when they've tried any kind of societal measure, apart from Georgia, so I'm told, because Georgia, for those of you who don't know and have very bad geography, I mean Georgia that's next to Armenia and Turkey. Georgia is an Orthodox country for the most part, and their Grand Patriarch will baptize the third child that families have. This is a societal encouragement because in Georgia they're very Orthodox and very religious, so having that type of religious and spiritual incentive to have more children probably would work in a society like Georgia, but it wouldn't work in the UK. So I suppose my closing point for this section is there's not going to be an easy fix, and any solutions or incentives that are put in place to encourage people to have more children is going to have to be a case by case, or nation by nation, or county by county, or city by city, because the reasons that people aren't having more children in a given area will be different, and I don't see this being discussed very often. What would help It's a very difficult question because, as I've just said, it's a very complex topic. Financial incentives in the UK may help people have more children. Spiritual incentives might also work in countries where people aren't having more children, but they're still very religiously in touch with their country. I think the solution to this is to have a directive, if you will, in national governments that gives local governments the powers to create incentives for people to have children, because doing it at a nation level or a national level or even a supranational level just isn't going to work, because the reasons why people aren't having children will vary from locality to locality, from nation to nation, because though the world is more integrated than ever before and more globalized than ever before, different countries are at different stages of globalization. In Eastern Europe and a lot of countries in the Far East, they are benefiting from the globalization, whereas in the UK or in America, in real terms, globalization isn't a benefit for most people. Thank you very much for watching. Please check out my Substack, which I'll link in the description. I'm sorry I haven't done a video in a while. I'm busy writing my book, which will be published next year with Imperium Press. Good night. God bless.